The bananas sitting in a grocery store in Fairbanks, Alaska, did not arrive easily. They were picked on a plantation somewhere in Central America, packed into refrigerated containers, loaded onto trucks heading toward the port of Tacoma in Washington state, transferred onto a cargo ship, hauled across the Gulf of Alaska through some of the roughest seas in the Northern Hemisphere, unloaded at the Don Young Port of Alaska in Anchorage, distributed across a warehouse network, and then, this is the part most people never think about, loaded onto a truck that a professional driver would take north through the Alaskan interior in the middle of January, through whiteout conditions, over mountain passes where avalanches are not a matter of if but when, across roads that can disappear entirely beneath drifting snow. By the time someone places that banana in their shopping cart, it has traveled through a chain of logistics so precise and so fragile that a single broken link, one delayed ship, one ice-covered pass, one truck engine that refuses to start at 40 below, can empty store shelves within days. The people who make that chain work are not in boardrooms. They are behind the wheel in the dark. If you're watching this from your living room, maybe on a TV while the winter night presses against your windows, then you already know how to find the subscribe button if you scroll down on your phone or tablet. A subscription and a share cost nothing, but they genuinely help this channel keep going and reach more people who've never heard these stories. Most people never think about where their groceries come from. They open a refrigerator door, reach for a carton of milk, and move on. They don't think about the 3,000 miles that carton traveled to get there. They don't think about the storm systems it crossed. They don't think about the man or woman behind the wheel of the truck that carried it north from Anchorage at 2 in the morning while the temperature outside the cab dropped below -40. Alaska has one of the most fragile and complex food supply chains of any populated region in the United States. And the people who hold it together are professional truck drivers operating in conditions most motorists would consider impossible. This is their story. To understand what Alaska's supply chain actually looks like, you have to start with a basic and uncomfortable fact. Alaska is not connected to the rest of the United States by land in any practical sense. There is no railroad linking it to the lower 48. There is no highway that crosses into the contiguous states without first passing through hundreds of miles of Canadian wilderness. The Alaska Highway, known as the ALCAN, runs more than 2,200 miles from Seattle to Fairbanks through British Columbia and the Yukon Territory. And while it is technically passable year-round, driving it in January is an entirely different category of experience from driving it in July. According to a FEMA-commissioned report published in 2023 and researched by Hillary Palmer of the planning and engineering firm Dewberry, roughly 95% of Alaska's imported food arrives by sea. The vast majority crosses the Gulf of Alaska on container ships operated by two companies, Tote Maritime and Matson, with cargo departing from the port of Tacoma and arriving at the Don Young Port of Alaska in Anchorage on a schedule of 4 deliveries per week. 2 from Tote, arriving on Tuesdays and Sundays, and 2 from Matson. That rhythm is not a luxury. It is the heartbeat of Alaska's food supply. When it skips a beat, Alaskans notice within days. What happens when a single ship in that rotation is delayed, even briefly, illuminates just how tight the margins are. In May of 2024, Tote Maritime's cargo vessel the North Star experienced a propulsion system failure shortly after departing Tacoma, Washington, forcing it to turn back for repairs. Fred Meyer's stores in Anchorage began reporting milk shortages within a week. Grocery shelves that Anchorage shoppers had taken for granted looked noticeably bare. Tote worked with its competitor Matson to reroute some of the freight and prevent a more severe shortage. But the episode was a vivid reminder of something that logistics professionals in Alaska already understood very well. As Grace Green, a vice president at Tote Maritime Alaska, put it during a separate ship delay in 2018, when disruptions hit that supply chain, things can become difficult rather quickly. Alaska's food prices are already the second highest in the nation after Hawaii. There is very little buffer built into the system. Every delay costs money, and in winter can cost more than that. The overland route, the Alaska Highway through Canada, handles a much smaller share of the total. That same FEMA-commissioned report found that roughly 4% of Alaska's imported food arrives by road. But that 4% represents a critical category of goods: the fresh produce, the meat, the perishables that need to move faster than a cargo ship can carry them. Walmart trucks its fresh meat and produce from Washington State to 7 of its 9 Alaska store locations via the ALCAN, using teams of 2 drivers so that one can sleep while the other drives, covering the more than 2,200 miles in a continuous push that, even with rest stops, takes the better part of 4 days. The company has also developed specialized equipment to protect its truck chassis from frost heaves, the upheavals in the road surface caused by water expanding as it freezes inside the permafrost beneath the asphalt. Frost heaves are one of the less dramatic but more persistent hazards of the ALCAN. They can appear without warning, turning a section of highway that looked smooth from a distance into a series of abrupt rises and drops that can, at speed, blow a tire, break a suspension component, or send a fully loaded trailer into a swerve that takes all of a driver's experience to control. In the Yukon Territory and along the Alaska-Canada border, the heaves are particularly severe, and in winter they occur alongside temperatures that the milepost travel guide notes can routinely reach -30 Celsius, about -22 Fahrenheit, with recorded lows dipping toward -44 Celsius in some sections of the Yukon. For a professional driver hauling 40,000 pounds of frozen food north through those conditions, a frost heave is not an inconvenience. It is a threat assessment. This is where it becomes important to understand what professional drivers know that most people do not. Keeping a trailer at the right temperature on the ALCAN in January is not simply a matter of setting a thermostat. The refrigeration units mounted on the front of trailers, the same units that keep produce cold in summer, face a different kind of problem in deep winter cold. At extreme temperatures, those units must work to keep cargo from freezing rather than from warming. Bananas, for instance, are destroyed by freezing. A trailer carrying fresh produce that loses its temperature regulation at -30 outside is not facing a slow degradation problem. It is facing a total loss, as documented in reporting from 2018. At least one Alaskan grocery chain lost an entire order when a driver failed to monitor the trailer temperature properly and the load froze solid on the way north. The company, as described by its logistics manager, simply ate the cost. That is the kind of thing that does not make headlines, but that drivers on the ALCAN carry in the back of their minds every mile of the run. There is also the matter of the fuel itself. Diesel at extreme temperatures begins to change character. The paraffin wax compounds naturally present in diesel fuel start to crystallize and solidify when temperatures drop far enough, turning what should be a flowing liquid into something closer to gel. This is called diesel gelling, and it can clog fuel filters and starve an engine of fuel without any warning. On the ALCAN in January, gelled fuel is not a hypothetical. Drivers and fleet operators use anti-gel additives in their fuel and keep fuel tanks as full as possible. A full tank provides more thermal mass and gels more slowly than a half-empty one, but these measures reduce the risk rather than eliminating it. The documented 2018 case of a driver stranded on the ALCAN with gelled fuel required a 12-hour rescue journey from Anchorage. On a highway where cell service is absent for the majority of the route and where emergency services can be hours away, 12 hours is not a dramatic delay. It is the actual response time. That knowledge changes how a professional driver approaches a winter run on the ALCAN in a way that is difficult to fully explain to someone who has never experienced it. Every fuel stop is evaluated. Every temperature reading is noted. The math of the next 100 miles is always running somewhere in the background. Once freight reaches Fairbanks, Alaska's second-largest city and the logistics hub for the interior and the far north, the supply chain does not simplify. It branches into territory that makes the ALCAN look well-serviced by comparison. For the communities and industrial camps north of Fairbanks, there is essentially one road: the Dalton Highway, also known as the Haul Road. The Dalton was built in 1974 in just 5 months to support construction of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, running 414 miles from the small community of Livingood, about 84 miles north of Fairbanks. all the way to Dead Horse and the Prudhoe Bay oil fields on the shore of the Arctic Ocean. Only about a quarter of the road's surface is paved. The remaining 75% is gravel and dirt, which in winter becomes a study in surface conditions that change by the mile, by the hour, and by the wind direction. Temperatures on the Dalton can drop below -50 Fahrenheit. The Alaska Trucking Association's own documentation on the highway notes that sudden snowstorms and whiteouts reduce visibility and increase risk, and that seasonal ice heaves routinely damage road surfaces. The phrase most often used by drivers familiar with the route is that it demands respect, not fear specifically. Respect. What makes the Dalton uniquely demanding in the context of food delivery is not just the road itself, but what the road lacks. There are only 3 communities along its 414 miles. The Yukon River Camp at mile 56 provides limited services and operates seasonally. Coldfoot, at mile 175, is the site of the only year-round truck stop north of Fairbanks on the entire route. The Coldfoot Camp, which sits 60 miles above the Arctic Circle and about 240 miles south of Prudhoe Bay. It is, in a precise geographic sense, the northernmost truck stop in North America. The camp has a small cafe, fuel, and a place to park and wait out weather. Beyond Coldfoot, there is nothing. No fuel stations, no restaurants, no services of any kind, for the remaining 240-plus miles to Dead Horse. A driver who loses a load of freight or experiences mechanical trouble in that stretch is dealing with a situation where help is measured not in minutes, but in hours of driving by whoever responds. Twice a week, trucks from carriers including Carlisle Transportation and Linden Transport make the run up the Dalton to supply the oil industry infrastructure at Prudhoe Bay. The cargo includes industrial equipment, fuel, and, critically, food for the thousands of workers living at the oil field camps in and around Dead Horse. Drivers who make this run regularly speak about it in terms that reflect genuine technical preparation, as described in reporting from heavy-duty trucking based on a ride-along with Linden Transport driver Fred McMillan. Trucks on the Dalton are not stock vehicles. They are modified for the conditions. Fuel heaters to prevent gelling, special filters, tires built for Arctic surfaces. Drivers carry tools to repair hoses, lines, filters, and motors in the field because there is no alternative. They carry enough food for 2 to 3 days in case they are stranded. Arctic cold weather gear that can sustain them if the cab loses heat, and sleeping bags rated for extreme temperatures. McMillan has, according to that same reporting, waited full days in his Peterbilt for state snowplows to punch through snowdrifts that had built up as high as his windshield. He waited, because waiting was the professional response. Moving before the road was cleared would not have been courage. It would have been a mistake with potentially fatal consequences. The pass that concentrates the risk most dramatically on the Dalton is Alaskan Pass, located in the corridor between roughly mile 241 and mile 247, where the road climbs through the Brooks Range. Alaska DOT identifies the pass at approximately 4,800 feet elevation, making it the highest road pass in Alaska and the only highway crossing of the Brooks Range. At Alaskan, the combination of elevation, narrow road, steep grades, sharp curves, and the funnel effect of the mountain terrain on wind creates conditions that can shift from manageable to dangerous in minutes. Avalanche risk is real and documented. In February of 2017, an avalanche in the Alaskan Pass corridor buried a semi-truck driven by Chuck Williams of Carlisle Transportation. Williams survived. His truck did not, at least not without significant recovery effort. The incident became one of the documented anchor events that drivers and dispatchers cite when discussing the genuine dangers of winter operations on the Dalton. Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska later testified in the United States Senate about a separate but related incident involving diesel exhaust fluid, DEF, freezing in equipment near Alaskan Pass, an event that illustrated how the extreme cold at altitude creates cascading mechanical failures that can leave drivers stranded in some of the most exposed terrain in North America. What most people who watch a grocery store dairy case being restocked do not realize is that the milk, the eggs, the produce, and the bread they see arranged on those shelves passed through this entire system, sometimes including a run up the Dalton, before it got there. The logistics chain for food in Alaska is less like a supply network and more like a relay race run over terrain that is actively trying to stop every leg of the race. And the runners are professional truck drivers, making judgment calls in real time about conditions that no routing algorithm fully captures. There is a temperature management challenge specific to winter food delivery in Alaska that gets almost no attention outside the industry. In warm climates, refrigerated trailers have one job: keep cargo cold. In Alaska in January, a driver hauling fresh produce faces the opposite problem for much of the run. Outside temperatures can fall far below the target temperature range for most produce. A trailer carrying lettuce needs to stay above freezing. Bananas cannot go below about 53 degrees Fahrenheit without beginning to sustain cellular damage. At -40 outside, a trailer that loses its heating system, because refrigeration units can both cool and heat, depending on how they are configured, will rapidly approach cargo-destroying temperatures. Drivers on the ALCAN and the Dalton monitor their trailer temperature displays the way pilots monitor instrument panels. Not constantly in a way that creates distraction, but regularly, with the kind of practiced awareness that becomes automatic after enough miles. When something changes, they know it before the alarm sounds. That is not intuition. That is expertise accumulated over thousands of miles of runs that most people will never hear about. Beyond the temperature, there is the weight. A fully loaded semi in Alaska can legally carry more than in many lower 48 states under specific conditions. But the trade-off is that heavier loads interact with difficult surfaces in ways that require constant adjustment. On a frost-heaved section of the ALCAN at -30, a 40,000-pound load in a trailer creates momentum forces that a driver has to anticipate rather than react to. Reacting is too slow. By the time a trailer begins to push a truck toward a shoulder that may or may not have a guardrail, the Dalton is largely without them. The situation has already moved beyond what reaction time can address. The drivers who run Alaska's winter roads understand this in a physical way that comes from experience, not from a manual. They slow down before the section of road that looks concerning, not because they have confirmed it is dangerous, but because they have learned to read the environmental signals that precede danger. The community of Coldfoot, with a year-round population that in winter often consists primarily of the truck stop staff and a small number of permanent residents, represents something important about how Alaska's food supply chain actually functions. It is not just a rest stop, it is a decision point. Drivers heading north to Deadhorse who encounter deteriorating weather, mechanical problems, or road closures have Coldfoot as their last reliable option before committing to the 240-mile run through the most remote section of the Dalton. The decision to continue north from Coldfoot or to wait is one that experienced drivers make carefully and not under pressure. The consequences of making that call wrong are severe enough that the culture among Dalton Highway regulars is one of measured caution rather than bravado. Drivers who push through conditions that other drivers have decided to wait out are not admired for it. The respect in that community goes to the driver who reads the situation correctly, whether that means going or stopping. For drivers who do make the full run to Deadhorse, the end of the road brings its own austere reality. Deadhorse is not a town in any traditional sense. It is an industrial camp, a collection of facilities serving the Prudhoe Bay oil field operations. With a year-round population that fluctuates based on work schedules but rarely includes many people who are there by personal choice rather than professional necessity. The Prudhoe Bay Hotel provides accommodation with 24-hour dining and basic services. But the landscape around it in January is unrelenting Arctic tundra under polar night. Drivers who reach Deadhorse after the run up the Dalton are not arriving at a destination that offers recovery in the conventional sense. They unload, rest as required by federal hours of service regulations, and prepare for the run south. The cargo they carried, food, equipment, supplies, will sustain the workers who keep one of North America's most important oil fields operating through conditions that the rest of the country barely registers. What this entire system requires, in human terms, is a particular kind of professional temperament. It is not recklessness. The drivers who survive long careers on the ALCAN and the Dalton are not risk-takers in the adrenaline-seeking sense of the term. They are risk managers who happen to work in environments where the risks are very large. They plan exhaustively. They monitor obsessively. They maintain their equipment with a seriousness that reflects the fact that a mechanical failure in the Dalton's interior is not a roadside annoyance. It is a survival problem. And they make decisions that, from the outside, can look like either caution or stubbornness, but that are in fact the product of careful calculation about what the road, the weather, and the load will allow. There is a phrase that circulates in the Alaska trucking community, not often spoken to outsiders, but understood by anyone who has made winter runs on the haul road. The truck doesn't know how cold it is until the driver forgets. It means that an experienced driver who has prepared correctly and is paying attention can move freight through conditions that would stop an unprepared vehicle within an hour. The preparation is the difference. The anti-gel additive in the fuel, the engine block heater plugged in at every stop, the extra blanket and the emergency food pack, the satellite communicator that works where cell service has not existed for the last 200 miles. The decision made 3 hours earlier to take the grade at a lower speed because the wind changed and the surface is probably different now. None of this is visible in a grocery store. None of it appears in the price printed on the sticker. But it is present in everything on the shelf. Alaska's food system is sometimes described by those who study it as a ship-to-shelf state. It is an accurate shorthand, but it leaves out the last part of the journey, the part that happens after the ship's dock in Anchorage, after the freight is loaded onto waiting trucks, after those trucks pull out of the distribution centers heading north and east and deeper into a state where winter is not a season that pauses for logistics. It leaves out the driver who crosses the Yukon River on the Dalton Highway bridge at 3 in the morning in February, watching the ice in the river below, while the temperature gauge in his cab tells him it is 52 below outside, doing the math on the remaining miles and the road report he picked up in Fairbanks and the temperature readings from his trailer. It leaves out the run through Alaskan Pass where the wind has built drifts across the road that require him to slow to a crawl and commit to pushing through rather than stopping. Because stopping, in that moment and in those conditions, is its own kind of risk. It leaves out the quiet competence of a person doing difficult work in the dark so that someone else, hundreds of miles away, will find what they need on a shelf the next morning. The next time you open a refrigerator in January and find it full, you are looking at the result of a system that does not stop for weather, does not pause for cold, and does not produce headlines unless something goes wrong. It works because people decide to drive the roads that others choose not to. If the supply chain required to feed Alaska in winter seems like an extraordinary undertaking, wait until you hear what happens when wildfire season changes the map entirely. When the roads that food travels through are the same roads that fire is moving along, and the drivers making the run have to decide how close is too close.